Hey all, so today we're going to wrap up our final section of our textbook and discuss income inequality and poverty. I think this is one of the most important discussions really and topics in economics, largely because I think this influences people's lives. And I think this is one of the largest questions economists try to face and have tried to face for an extremely long time. So I want to highlight though with the states with the highest levels of income inequality for 2019. And we're going to find some really interesting tidbits here. I want you to notice that this isn't so much a north-south divide as much as it is a Midwest-Northwest versus South and East Coast. So with the rare exception of California, which is number 4 for income inequality, we'll zoom in. Notice that the other worst states are states like New York and Connecticut, Massachusetts, Florida, Louisiana, and California. So there is a wide swath of states all around the country that have high degrees of inequality. And the wealth of these states varies dramatically. For example, Virginia is one of the wealthiest southern states, and it has relatively low income inequality. While Illinois, let's see here to find an opposite example. Well, to quite a few here in the South, for example, Mississippi, right, is a quite high degree of income inequality, similarly with Louisiana. So while New York is a rich state, which has a high degree of income inequality along with California. So these are interesting questions, and it shows us that there aren't easy links and connections. I want to highlight one more example for you. Notice that Georgia is number 7 in the country for income inequality. And it's not hard to imagine why, right? If you drive to Atlanta, certainly there's incredibly ritzy areas of Atlanta. And if you drive outside of Atlanta, through its suburbs and through the cities just northeast of Atlanta, there's a lot of money and a lot of wealth. But in the rest of the state, it changes a lot, right? Just think about Macon or driving down further south from Macon into deep southern Georgia. And there's a lot of people in the state in a lot of different places. And so we can see that a vast swath of income inequality can exist within the state and typically does. And why I said this is such an important concept because it informs what we think about what policies should be passed in states. For example, should schools, high schools, public education be publicly funded or locally funded? If you have a state where you have a high degree of income inequality, you're probably actually going to lean towards being locally funded, but that creates inequalities in schools. So let's get into this directly. How do we measure inequality? Well, one thing I want to kick us off with and really get kind of a little fun little banter here is Winston Churchill, who is the maker of excellent quotes while also a fairly troublesome figure, has a great quote, though. The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of its blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of its miseries. And so the quote that Churchill was making, of course, is he was quite pro-capitalism and basically made the argument that yes, there's inequality, but everyone is better off in it, while socialism only promises a superficial equality and an equal poverty. But there are two good points to draw from this quote, though. Markets achieve greater prosperity than without them. That is true. Markets are fundamentally an aspect of capitalism, and markets are certainly more productive and offer more prosperity. However, the prosperity which marks market-based economies isn't equally shared. So I mentioned to you all way back at the beginning of the semester a guy by the name of Arthur Okun, and he has a great book. It's short, 140 pages that you should really check out called Equality and Efficiency. And Arthur Okun, for example, he was the chief advisor for Lyndon B. Johnson, the chief economic advisor for LBJ, and he also was one of the major influences in the creation and design of the War on Poverty and the Great Society. But so great resource to read that gets at some of these economic questions we're going to talk about. But there's some big questions that then spring from questions of inequality. How much inequality is there in our society? We want to know, right? What's the gap? How many people live in poverty? This is the next question. How many people are not making it by? How many people need assistance? What problems arise in measuring the amount of inequality? Measurement, of course, is a fictitious measurement, right? Like it's a math, it's a sum. So this brings us to another question. What problems arise? How often do people move between income classes? This is the next question. Are the people that are in poverty today likely to move out and get to middle class in the future? Or is this something that, no, if income class, you're more likely to be stuck there? If people are moving and flowing, that's a good sign, right? That means this is kind of sorting out people's welfare and income, and this is the market adjusting and kind of determining who gets what efficiently. But if people are stuck and stagnant, that suggests there's greater issues at play. So I want to zoom in real quick and focus some statistics for the United States income inequality. This on the left-hand side is quintiles. This is basically the bottom 20%, the 20 to 40th percentile, the 40th to 60th percentile, etc. And this is that's how quintiles work. And it basically tells you what is the median family income in each 20th percentile of families. So basically, or sorry, not the median, but it tells you what if your family makes this income, what percentage of Americans are you with? So if you make below $27,000 a year, you're in the bottom fifth of all income earning households. If you make between 27,000 to 48,000, you are in what we might call the lower middle class. And if you're in the middle fifth, this is actually the middle class income. This is 48,000 to 75,000. And then if you get to the fourth fifth, you're in the 75,000 to $115,000 a year. Again, this is kind of upper middle. And then above that, you're into the top fifth if you're in the top 20% of all income earners if you make 150,000 and over. The very top 5% make over $205,000 a year. So I want to highlight some interesting things for you. Americans don't like saying they're anything other than the middle class unless it's like unquestionably undeniable they're not in the middle class. And you can see though in the quintiles that being middle class is a lot more difficult than we'd suspect, right? Because if middle class is somewhere between $48,500 to $75,000 a year, well, that means that the middle class actually is quite small, not as large as we think, and it's a much higher income level than we'd suspect. Also, you might hear often people in the top fifth or fourth fifth say something to the effect of, we live quite comfortably, is the phrase they typically say, something to that effect. So that's something that's kind of unique to America where everyone likes to say they're middle class. But the quintiles show us that it's not quite the truth and it's not quite as close as we might like. So how do we think about this income inequality then? Another way of measuring it is looking at how owned in the United States is owned by each quintile. And what I want you to see here is notice that for the bottom fifth, the bottom 20% of households in America, the amount of wealth they owned has fluctuated between 5.5% at its peak in 1970 and 3.8% its trough in the present. So of all the wealth in America, the bottom 20% of families only have about 3.8% of the total wealth in the country. Now, if we move to the second fifth, we see that this has fluctuated between 12.2% and 9.2%. And similarly, we can see similar fluctuations across the board, 17.8 to 15.1 for the middle fifth. The fourth fifth has stayed fairly kind of constant, just 24.3 to 20.9. The top fifth, 51.7 was its peak, but it's kind of returned to 49. The top 5%, though, at their peak was 26.5, dipped to 15.3, and is now back to 21.3%. So the top 5% of Americans, for example, own 5 times as much wealth as the bottom fifth of Americans do today. That gives us some ideas of inequality. Now, this brings us to other interesting questions then of, Well, if the bottom fifth only, like, this is a percentage of the total wealth in America, and we know America is an incredibly, incredibly, incredibly wealthy country. So maybe that doesn't mean the bottom fifth is struggling too bad. That's where another statistic we're going to get into here in a second, the poverty rate, tells us a bit more about that question. But first, I want to show you an example, though, of how it is kind of difficult to interpret this information for some greater truth between the wealth of a nation and inequality. So if we zoom in here and look at some global inequality numbers, notice that Japan is the lowest inequality in the world. That is 3.4. Japan, of course, is a wealthy country. Ethiopia is considered a middle income to lower middle income country, and it also has low inequality. Germany, really rich country, has a low degree of inequality. Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in the world, very low degree of inequality. Egypt, lower middle, lower income country, fairly equal society. South Korea, very rich country, fairly equal society. The United States we find is over here at about 8.5% is the income distribution. And again, very, very, very wealthy country, wealthiest in the world. South Africa, one of the poor countries in the world, a insanely high degree of inequality. Now, I want to give you a perfect example here of a country that discrimination plays a huge role in this. South Africa had its version of apartheid, which was basically a even more severe version of Jim Crow in the U.S. South, but integrated at a national level. That is one of the major roles that has played. It has played a major role in determining income inequality in South Africa. But the point of this, though, is that ultimately what we see is there's no clear relationship between rich countries are less equal and poor countries are more equal. It is a bit up in the air. Now, the poverty rate becomes an important question for us because this is the percentage of the population whose family income falls below an absolute level called the poverty line. Now, I apologize for some reason my PDFs get, or my, not PDFs, my PowerPoints get messed up in the presentation for some reason and distorts where it is. But the important thing here is the poverty line is the absolute level of income set by the federal government for each family size. And if a family makes below that line, it's deemed to be in poverty. So basically, the federal government arbitrarily picks a number. They use this based upon an idea of what it costs to live in the country, to pay rent for a decent home, to afford a car, etc. All these things, and this factors into the poverty line. Now, if we zoom in here, we can see the poverty rate in the United States and how it was at its peak at about 22.5% in 1960 and has since dropped and fluctuated in between this 12.5 to 15%. So what this is telling us is 15% of Americans live in poverty. We find that we're saying that 15% of all Americans do not make enough to live what we consider a basic standard of living. Now, why did we have this crash in 22.5% to 12 to 15%? The answer is the Great Society that I mentioned earlier, Arthur Ocon. The Great Society and the War on Poverty introduced a lot of welfare programs to help families that were below the poverty line and bump up their income. Now, there is a double-edged sword of this. Of course, if you factor in these transfers, then it helps families and it makes the real income and reduces the poverty rate. However, the war on poverty has also gone more expensive. And that raises a problematic question, right? Is the war on poverty just topping people up who are struggling, or is the war on poverty helping people get out of poverty? So those are kind of debated questions here. There are three things that remarkably shape our poverty statistics. Ultimately, one, it's highly correlated with race. I believe whites and Asians have the lowest amounts of poverty. African Americans and Hispanic Americans have higher rates. It's also correlated with age. I believe it is younger people are more likely to be in poverty than older individuals. And that makes sense, right? Older individuals have had a lifetime to accrue wealth. And finally, the last thing is it's correlated with family composition. Larger families are more impoverished than smaller families. Now, there's problems in measuring inequality. One of those things is those in-kind transfers I mentioned, transfers to poor families given in the forms of goods and services rather than cash. You can't really factor that in, right, to a family's earnings. We can't factor in like the stamp program, and the electronic EBT we now offer families to help them purchase goods and necessities. So those things are difficult, and they ultimately improve people's standards of living, so that it makes it more difficult for us to fully gauge the degree of suffering people are facing and challenges they're facing in their life. Another aspect of this, though, is there's the economic life cycle, and that is there's a regular pattern of income variation over a person's life. Are we finding that we have people in poverty today that are always in poverty, or are they currently unemployed or unemployed for a year, even though they've done fairly well for most of their life? And the fact they're unemployed for a year means their income's really low. Or is it just that they're a young person that has a bit of debt from college and they're trying to build their life now and get started? And so, yeah, of course, the numbers skew that they look impoverished, but they'll improve and get out of it. This leads us to another thing. There's transitory and permanent income. So permanent income refers to a person's normal income. It's your 2-week paycheck. It's a monthly salary. These are the streams of income that determine your life. However, transitory income are things like when you sell a good on the side or when you turn around and sell books. Those forms of income, right? They don't factor into your overall wealth. I don't know anyone that posts something on Craigslist and goes, "Yeah, I sold this," and then goes, "I will make sure I deduct this to the IRS tax." It's one of those things, right, that people don't do, even though they're supposed to. So that transitory money shock doesn't quite see its full effect. And then economic mobility. Again, like I mentioned, this is the fact that people can move down from current income status. So we don't know whether the poverty rate is capturing a noticeable amount of people that perhaps are just down on their luck and will bounce back, or if it's catching a lot of people who are stuck here for long periods of time. Now, because inequality is such a core question that economists are trying to solve, there are a lot of political theories about how to address it. And there's three major schools of thought. Those schools are utilitarianism, liberalism, and libertarianism. Now, in the utilitarian school, this is the political philosophy according to which the government should choose policies that maximize the quote unquote total utility of everyone in society, hence the name. Now, what we mean by utility is this is basically a fictional measurement of satisfaction, given that we can't actually ask people what will make them happiness. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who really created the school of thought, and it's big around the 1850s, 1860s. So it's a very 19th century school of thought. The next school of thought is liberalism. This kind of springs from the New Deal and a lot of that period, and this kind of optimism in the work of government adopts the idea that government should choose policies deemed just, as evaluated by an impartial observer behind a veil of ignorance. The guy that proposed this is John Rawls. He was a Harvard philosopher. And John Rawls, I believe Harvard philosopher, one of the Ivies. John Rawls, though, his big argument was that justice should occur to someone who without context, right? Like you can go up to someone, tell them a story, and they should say, well, that's not fair. And whatever the decision of the person that comes in and says, well, that's not fair, this of course seems what is fair, that's the idea of the veil of ignorance. If we just introduced policies to someone that had no other reference of context, what kind of intuitive decision do we arrive at? The final school of thought is libertarianism, and this is the idea that the political philosophy which underpins the idea that government should punish crimes and enforce voluntary agreements, but not redistribute income. And its big proponent's a guy by the name of Robert Nozick. And Robert Nozick is a contemporary of John Rawls, and as you could probably guess, they're fiercely critical of each other's arguments. But Nozick's idea was that in a meritocratic society, and in a society that rewards effort, it's impossible to redistribute justly. Basically, redistribution becomes to some degree a form of theft. And also, it doesn't necessarily even fix the problems we're talking about. It doesn't actually solve poverty. It is just a perpetual reset. It's a Robert Nozick, again, very critical of Rawls, but his argument basically is that the government can't be restarting a race because it doesn't like the outcome of the race. Now, these are simplifications of all three arguments. These are much more complicated arguments. There's a lot more detail and depth to them, but they are the fundamental underpinnings of how we consider what should we do to redistribute income. And the policies we consider now are things like minimum laws, which we've discussed in the past. And that, again, is we set a floor for the amount of income someone can make. Welfare, that was the government is acting with programs that supplement the incomes of those in need. We also mentioned the negative income tax system. And the negative income tax system is a tax system that collects revenue from high income households and provides subsidies to low income households. And so basically, it is a direct cash transfer through the tax system, but it is fairly lean and requires little administration. You also have in-kind transfers. This is direct relief through needed goods and services. And we've talked about this. These are things like food stamps. And then finally, we have anti-poverty programs and work incentives. And there's a delicate balance with these policies because there's a question of, is there perverse incentives? Ideally, right, we want to offer policies which help people to improve their lives and get the lives they want. We don't necessarily want to create a welfare system which subsidizes people to persist in poverty. Now, the final thought I want you to leave you with is that inequality is one of the fundamental questions in economics. It's actually as old as Plato. So pre Jesus Christ, Plato has these questions of inequality. And to a degree, you see Jesus having similar thoughts and questions on inequality. And then you see in economics inequality occurring over the 18th century, over the 19th century, over the 20th century, and now even more vibrantly, perhaps than ever, into the present. It's important, though, because it's unsolved and because it defines our aspirations for the society we want to inhabit. All right, all. That wraps up our final section of the textbook. I have one more video for you all. We're going to introduce the theory of utility and consumer preferences. But that's for the next one. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed. I think this is a fascinating question and absolutely consider it more. All right, take